tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We will begin with the karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ehi aka ana, te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, tihei, mauri ora. Mauri ora, tēnā koutou, talofa lava, assalamu alaikum, olavinaka, namaste, ni hao, shalom, allahu apa. Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to our Race Relations Day 2024 panel. Ko Katuk Damian toku ingoa. I am Dr. Katuk Damian, Principal Advisor to the Human Rights Commissioners at Te Kāhui, Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission. And I will be facilitating today's panel. Every year on March 21st, we celebrate Race Relations Day, a day for everyone in Aotearoa New Zealand to come together to celebrate our diverse communities and promote harmonious relations. This day also coincides with the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is observed globally to remember the 1960 Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. This year also marks 5 years since the March 15 terror attacks in Christchurch. We acknowledge the 51 shuhada, survivors and witnesses, their whānau and the wider Muslim community in Aotearoa. We remember loved ones who lost their lives in this violent, hateful act, and those suffering still. We remain dedicated to upholding and respecting each other, eliminating racism and religious prejudice, and celebrating our diversity. In acknowledgement of this anniversary and in the spirit of this year's Race Relations Day theme, kia tapatahi, building safer and united communities together, our panel will discuss the role of religion and faith in bringing about racial harmony in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are, of course, many ways one could approach this theme and the intersections between religion, faith, and race. We acknowledge that, of course, we are missing many perspectives from this panel, and we will not be able to cover all the necessary conversations that need to be had on this topic. It is impossible for any panel or event to be able to be fully representative of the many diverse faith communities in Aotearoa, including the diversity within faith communities and the many pressing issues that need to be discussed and provided a platform. It is clear to us that this is a topic that resonates with many communities, so more opportunities and spaces should be created to explore and discuss this topic. We hope this panel is the beginning of many more discussions to come. Our dear panelists are all leaders and experts in their own right, but they are coming to us to speak from an individual perspective. They speak to us from their own experiences. They are, of course, not representative of their faith or cultural communities, and all of them are speaking in their individual capacities. Indeed, it is their insights drawn from experiences and applying faith and religious perspectives to advance racial harmony in the spaces that they occupy that drew us to inviting them to speak today. And we look forward to widening these conversations over time to many others who equally have much more to contribute to this discourse. We will have about 30 minutes of a panel discussion together, which is very exciting. And there'll be some time at the end for questions. You will see the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you've used Zoom before, please use that function. You know where to find it. Put in a question. And as always, a gentle reminder to please be respectful of our panelists' lived experiences and the perspectives and insights that they share. I now have the great honor and joy to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. So we have dear Andre Afamasaga. Andre is Samoan, Christian, and Rainbow. An ex-pastor, Andre is a leader and speaker on human rights and social cohesion. Golriz Lucina Gundry, Iranian, Armenian and Baha'i. Golriz is a New York Times best-selling author and co-founder of SoulPancake, which uses the power of storytelling to connect hearts and create a shared vision for the future of humanity. And we have Tahirah Moton, Muslim, Ngāti Maniapoto, Pakistani. Tahirah has a background in public health and advocacy and is passionate about Indigenous self-determination. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you again for your time, your presence, and your willingness to have this conversation today. Let's just jump right in. We've got, I guess it's probably appropriate to just first by asking a personal question or to ask you to reflect personally on why you feel it's important for us to be talking about this today. What is the reason we should explore the relationship between faith and racial harmony? And so I think maybe Andre, if we could start with you in the spirit of being going in alphabetical order, would love to hear your thoughts. Kia ora.
Awesome. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, ni hao, namaste, and warm Pacific greetings. I wish to acknowledge Ngāti Whenua, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and also Te Aotearoa Mana Whenua from where I'm zooming in from, which is New Plymouth, and of course also the loved ones of the Shahuda of the March 15 terrorist attacks. Thank you. It's so privileged to be part of this discussion. I think one of the reasons it's so important to me is that I'm Samoan, part of the wider Pacific group here in New Zealand, and in Aotearoa New Zealand, up to about 70% of Pacific people identify as having some form of religion, and mostly Christian as well. And so within that, there's a lot of different intersections. There's a really rich history there. There's a history of colonization, not only across the Pacific, but the enduring legacy of colonization here in New Zealand as well, for Pacific communities and other communities, as colonization, as well as the force of missionization, has been agents to actually suppress who we are. And yet, on the other hand, when you look at the plight or the socioeconomic status and the position of Pacific people in New Zealand, unfortunately, alongside Tangata Whenua Māori, we inhabit a lot of the lower social statistics, whether it's health, education, you name it, housing, and income as well. So within that intersection, the church has also been a really positive force in the life of many Pacific peoples, where government, where community, where society has not been able to help Pacific people, the church has. And so there's many intersections here, as we also just deal with the legacy in terms of colonization upon our own people. And in my case, in Pacific people's case, religion and our race, our cultures are inextricably linked. It is really hard for us to understand where one starts and where the other one finishes. And in some ways, it makes way for a really united, coherent identity in terms of who we are, because we see it reinforced by our religion and our culture. But on the other hand, it can be really tricky as well, when sometimes religion or scriptural ancient texts don't line up with modern day realities of who we are. So in my case, I'm Samoan, proudly so, and proudly grow up in my church. But when I realized that I was gay, and I was also a pastor as well, I faced that tension there, because in order for me to accept who I was would mean to actually go not only against my religion, being Christian, but also going against my culture. And that's when you can find those real tension points. So this is a really important discussion, I believe, for us to talk about how it affects people in the middle of some of those tensions like us, but then more broadly, in light of those realities, how can places like churches, religions, have a constructive and a really positive role to play as well. For someone like me, and I'll just be quiet in a moment, that was a real struggle for me to accept myself. And for many people like myself who eventually accept ourselves, sometimes it means to actually abandon our religion and our faith. But in my case, I've decided not to do that. And I understand that that's not understood by everyone, but it is something that works for me. And so I think it's really important to pick up these nuances.
Hi, Andre. Thank you so much for sharing that personal and the complexities and the sensitivities with this topic as well. Really appreciate that. Golriz, what about for you?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Sorry, I sound a bit stuffy. I'm just getting over a head cold. But very honored to be here, and really was just captured with what Andre was sharing. I think for me, this question of why it's important to sort of dive into this relationship between faith and harmony, racial harmony, and other types of harmony is really, for me, the whole sort of principle of why I even have a faith. I believe that it's, you know, all of these religions are really here to remind us of our inherent oneness. That we really are this like one human family. And when I look into the world, I actually have so much empathy for people who want to discard faith and religion because they've seen it as actually a force for division and for separating us, for creating this like us and them and this hierarchy of who has value and who has contribution and who doesn't. And I think that from a very superficial perspective, it can be seen like that. Well, you know, religion is the reason these two, cultures are warring or hurting each other or harming each other. But for me, the animating principle of faith is really to bind us together, to really do the work to understand within myself where I have prejudice and bias and hatred, which, you know, is just the shadow side of fear and ignorance, and to really expunge that. And so, you know, my faith as a Baha'i, our whole purpose is to really build unity. And I think that can often sound very sort of woo-woo and like a little kumbaya, like, okay, great, let's all join hands and sing together and walk off into the sunset. But it actually requires such training and discipline and like I said, that sort of excavation of our insides to find where we are holding on to those biases and those discriminations and what it takes to kind of pull that out of us and really work together hand in hand, and not in a way that it's like, okay, now we're all the same and so we can march off into the sunset, but actually to really appreciate you know, the diversity, and then to be able to build unity within that diversity. So I love this conversation. I think faith is an instrumental part of recognizing that oneness. And so I get very nervous when we want to just throw out religion and figure out how to all get along, because that to me is the whole point of why these religions exist, is really to bring us back to the fact that we're one human family. And, you know, science agrees. This isn't just some sort of like, you know, spiritual ideology. This is science is telling us we're one species. So to then have these divisions and to create the separateness, to me, is just such a fallacy. And yeah, I love exploring this topic. Thank you for having me here.
Merci, Golriz. Thank you for bringing us back to the big question of why this is an important topic for you, why you've, I guess, accepted to be speaking about it today, and ultimately really thinking about the importance of faith in practice, that it has a purpose, that it has a result that we're trying to work towards, which is, as you mentioned, unity and realizing our inherent oneness. Thank you. I'd love to hear from you, Tahirah. What about for you? Why do you personally think this is an important intersection to talk about?
Kia ora, Kat, and kia ora korua, Andre and Golriz. It was beautiful to hear your korero and the diversity of how we've all, you know, taken different parts of the question. And thank you also for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. For me, it's really important. I guess my answer will be in relation to why it's really important in a local Aotearoa context to have this conversation. And I think it's really important to explore that intersection between ethnicity and faith, because there are lots of shared experiences between, especially in terms of the oppression, you know, that we face. There are lots of shared experiences and indeed intersections between, like in my case, being Muslim intersects with me being a person of color, being Māori and being Pakistani. And we also, and also in the case of Islam, we really need, Islam is often conflated as being an ethnic group or as being Arab, and it's important to acknowledge the diversity within Islam and amongst Muslims. So that's another reason why it's important to explore that intersection and to see them for the overlaps, but also the differences as well. And I think particularly in the context of Aotearoa and in light of the 5th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on March 15th, the reason behind that, racism wasn't the only driver behind those terrorist attacks, it was Islamophobia. And we can't ignore the fact that this was a target attack on Muslims because of their faith, because of our faith. I think New Zealand is really, like, some of that, hiding of that reality of Islamophobia comes from the fact that New Zealand is hardly ready to have a conversation about the fact that we're a settler colonial state, and racism is rife within New Zealand and institutionalized within our society, and we're hardly ready, we're in denial about that fact, and we hide behind words like unconscious bias to try to make it more palatable and soften the language around that. So I really see that reality as being a reason why we're even further removed from being ready to have the conversation around the fact that we're an Islamophobic society as well. And that is only gives more reason to have that conversation and explore that intersection. And I think I said we're not ready, but I think we should be ready, especially 5 years on from March 15th. We really saw a rhetoric of this isn't us, like, how could this happen here? When we talk about racism and Islamophobia, we talk about it as existing in pockets and as the underbelly of New Zealand society. But I think March 15th was a stark manifestation of that it is present here, and it's not just underlying, it's apparent, and that we need to have these conversations to see how we can move forward. I also think in that sort of realm, I also think it's important because the motivations behind the March 15th terrorist attacks, and going back to the fact that Islam is a diverse religion and there's diversity amongst Muslims, is that white supremacy was the driver behind it, and white supremacy doesn't, the fact that white Muslims exist and Pākehā Muslims exist, and indeed were victims of the March 15th attacks, Allah yarhamhum, shows that, and indeed the terrorist, he specifically said that he has a particular issue with white Muslim converts because he sees them as race traitors. And how could you give up your white privilege and your status as a supposedly high status as a white person to how can you give that up to join a faith community like Islam? And the fact that if you're white and a Muslim, white supremacy is not sophisticated enough to make that distinction between that diversity, which is another reason to fight against it. And being Muslim would trump your whiteness, and you're seen, especially if you're visibly Muslim, that trumps everything, and that's racism doesn't account for that. And so I think that's why it's another reason why it's important to have these conversations about those nuances. Yeah, that's me.
Oh, kia ora, Tahirah. Thank you so much. It's very, very powerful. And thank you for speaking directly to the context of Aotearoa, the challenges that we are facing, questions that we have to be asking, conversations we need to learn how to have, the discomforts that we need to lean into. I particularly found, your point around the institutionalized nature of both religious and racial prejudices, thinking about how, institutionalizing discrimination not only shapes individual, experiences, but also our collective consciousness and our collective experiences of these biases, and just how personal it is, and how important it is that we have a lens into the specifics sometimes when we do zone out and we think about this sort of idea of racial harmony or a society that's free of religious prejudice. But in order for us to get there, we do need to reckon with some of these challenges, as Andre also very poignantly mentioned around some of those specifics around other conflicting identities and finding points of unity, which Golriz reminded us is ultimately the purpose of all faiths and religions, is to bring that into reality and to practice. So I wonder if, like, on that note of like, so then what do we kind of almost like so what does that look like in practice? Like, well, how do we do this in practice? How do we bring these lofty ideals of unity and living in harmony and social cohesion? And like you said, Tahirah, depending on whatever language you talk about, removing unconscious bias or, battling with white supremacy, whatever language we're using, but to foster that unity that we're trying to seek, what does that look like in practice? How have you personally seen your faith community attempting to do this in practice? Do you have some tangible examples that you perhaps have personally engaged with, or that you've seen that you would find that the audience would find useful? So again, going kind of that alphabetical, they would go to Golriz first. I would really love to hear your perspective, and then we'll go around to the other panelists.
Did you say alphabetical, but starting with me?
Well, because I started with Andre first,
okay.
And so then you're the next with the first question. So yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so, I think one thing as a Baha'i is this idea that we actually have this twofold moral purpose. And what that means is, we're working on ourselves as individuals, and we're trying to really show up as the sort of highest consciousness version of ourselves, right? So there's prayer and meditation and work that goes into that, readying ourselves to be a part of bettering this world. Like, if we're actively wanting to better this broken world, there's some rolling up your sleeves and some hard work, some agency and some choices that we make. And so this twofold moral purpose is partly on the independent side of what we have to do to transform ourselves. But then the second part of it is then we do that in order to transform society. So they have to go hand in hand. They can't just be this focus on like, I'll go off into a cave and do my work and become, a peaceful embodied person. But to what? So what? And I think, the two things do have to straddle each other, because I actually do a lot of like going off into caves and doing some work on myself, and I come out feeling like blissed out by nature and how lucky I am to be alive. And the second I'm in community, I'm like, oh, now I'm annoyed, now I'm frustrated, now my triggers are coming up. Now I'm coming from a fear response or a lack or what have you. So it really gives you a chance to put all of those sort of lofty ideals into practice when we're in community. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about what I'm seeing happen with my faith community, but frankly, with any well-wisher of humanity, any person that wants to kind of also roll up their sleeves and better this world in a really strategic way and being part of a process, not just kind of a piecemeal, like when they feel like it, but actively transform their neighborhood, their community. Baha'is are doing a series of spiritual transformation classes, and it starts at early childhood, where we're meeting and gathering groups of children from any faith, any background, non-faith, but other people who want to build a better world, and parents who want to build a better world for their children, to come together and talk about these principles. So when you're sitting there doing classes with 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and saying to them, like, we are fruits of one tree, we're leaves of one tree, we're waves of one ocean, like these things that sound a little bit cheesy, but for a child, that's real, that's imprinting, that's for them remembering like we are. And actually kids have no problem with this. Like, when I do these classes with children, they're the ones they believe it immediately because they feel it, they see that we're all one. But to me, it really starts from that level. Is like, we have to start with each generation and sort of expunge this fear base, these prejudices that are so systemic and so deeply rooted. And so there's this sort of twofold thing that's happening. We're growing and cultivating and building, while also I'm very aware that these old world order systems are crumbling, and necessarily so. So there's two things happening at once. And when I put too much attention into like the destruction of it all, like it can be kind of a vortex that I fall into, and it's deeply traumatizing because along the way, many people are getting harmed, and there's a lot of injustice that's happening, and people don't want to give up their power. But at the same time, like if I can really focus my efforts on rebuilding a world anew that has these principles of justice and equity and oneness for all deeply embedded in it, that also takes a lot of work. It's not just something that can be done with lip service. So these spiritual transformation classes, sort of open to everyone, have been, even for me, very confirming in my faith, because it's a very practical application. It's no longer just kind of this thing we do on a certain day and we, you know, all come together and we're harmonious and united. We're actually building community around these values and sharing that together and sort of creating a net to catch people as these other systems are coming crumbling down.
So powerful, Golriz. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, this idea of focusing on integration and not the destruction around us, but being very practical about it and having to reckon with community and the challenges that come with actually, quote unquote, doing the work, right? And not necessarily doing the work in that sort of purely individual self, though, as you mentioned, that's incredibly important, but being able to do that work in community, in practice with others, and also with others, as you said, with no faith or with not a particular faith, or having those spaces open to all and really engaging with diversity in practice and learning about that in action rather than only in theory, right? So that's really powerful. Thank you so much. Tahirah, what about for you? What are some examples that you've seen in practice?
Oh, kia ora. Yeah, I just wanted to say, Golriz, your answer, really resonated a lot with me, particularly around the, collective action, and the values of social justice. And that's sort of informs my answer as well, as from my faith community, what I see is like, an offering that it can give to this, struggle for racial and religious harmony, is the focus on social justice. There's a strong ethic of social justice and a fight against oppression within Islam. And that comes right back from the early days of Islam, where Islam mainly was embraced by people who were oppressed and people who were disenfranchised. And that continues today. And we see that Islam is the fastest growing religion amongst in the world, including amongst Māori, and in our prison populations particularly, we see Islam growing. And Andre, something you said earlier about the intersection again between your faith and ethnicity, you don't know where you start and stop, and that's the case for me too. So being Māori, these values of, social justice that exists within Islam also exists for me, and that I come from a Māori worldview in that sense too, and seeing those overlaps and that intersection is another thing that I think is an offering that we can take forward. And I think a really good example of this is the solidarity we see amongst Māori, and the recognition amongst Māori that the genocide in Gaza is an Indigenous struggle, and that it's a decolonial struggle. And we see that, they're coming together, the recognizing of that, and it goes both ways. And, the Palestinian ambassador was how he was welcomed at Waitangi, and apparently got the most warm welcome, because there's that recognition of a shared struggle of oppression in the face of colonialism. Of course, in much different contexts, but the underlying drivers of that are the same, and we need to recognize that we're connected in this way, and that fight is our fight, and our fight is everyone's fight, and that's how we're going to move forward. And I think another offering that Islam provides, again with the example of Palestine, is seeing the strength that Palestinians have, particularly in Gaza, in the face of genocide, and that we can't ignore the fact that Islam, like it's often painted, the fact that most Palestinians are Muslim is often ignored from the conversation about Palestine, and it's just seen as a colonial struggle. And while it is the case, the Muslim aspect is so important to all of this as well. And I think that's a really strong offering, and we see how that faith, Islam provides, in Islam we call it iman, and that's that sort of, you know, that really strong held faith that Palestinians hold on to even in the face of genocide and ethnic cleansing. And even amongst, you know, particularly in the month of Ramadan, we see Palestinians praying and breaking their fast amongst the rubble of their masjids, our mosques, and, you know, drawing on their faith as a source of strength. So I think that's, you know, at an individual level and as a collective level, those are some important things. And then another example, bring it again back to a local example of like collective resistance, I guess, and intersections, is up in Auckland, they're developing and establishing the first Māori masjid, and like coming together of those two cultures, you know, ethnicity and religion, and those two worlds coming together. And it's called the Center of the Islamic Center of the South Pacific, I think. And it's like, it's meant to be, you know, drawing in those beautiful aspects of Te Ao Māori that are so compatible with Islam. They're often seen as incompatible, but really they aren't. I mean, of course, there are differences, and we have to honor those as well. But yeah, that's, I think, a beautiful example of ways, you know, in practice that we can come together and bring our different worlds together. And that's seen as like, you know, that will be a place for not just for Māori Muslims, but for all, it is for like Muslims of the South Pacific, including our Pacific Islands, and that being, you know, a central hub for us. And I think those examples of, coming together and our shared humanity again, is the path forward.
Ngā mihi nui, Tahirah. I was thinking about how, you know, like just starting with that concept that when we look at the oppressed and the disadvantaged populations, whether, you know, domestically or internationally, you know, as you mentioned, Andre, you know, we have to reckon with colonization as well. We have to reckon with the harm of institutional religion, and Golriz, you mentioned it as well, around the pain that it brings to us when we think about what can be done in the name of faith and religion, and not only the immediate impacts, but the generational impacts, the collective impacts. And that point you mentioned, Tahirah, around the underlying drivers of injustice and prejudice, really at their essence are one and the same. And so we can't ignore, you know, one injustice somewhere and say that we are fighting for justice anywhere. So thank you so much for that reminder. Andre, I think I saw you unmute and then I spoke over you. My apologies.
No.
I'd love to hear
all.
your thoughts also from some your faith community. Thank you.
Yeah, I really just love the kōrero in terms of this idea of faith being active. And so, you know, I'm a former pastor, and I don't mean to trigger anyone, but in the words of Jesus, there's, you know, he was very much about that action orientation and that social justice as well. And anyone that knows anything about Christianity, one would argue that perhaps he saw a very poor, very terrible application of what that faith was meant to stand for, and then his coming into the world is meant to represent and embody that, like what that really meant. And to show faith in action, there's a verse in James that says faith without deeds is dead. And so it's really important that religion and faith is really active, but not active in a way that is destructive, but active in a way that really helps and builds hope and brings love as well. So when I look at my own faith tradition, I'm Seventh-day Adventist, but that comes from the wider family in terms of Christianity. I'm proud when I think of things like the abolition of slavery, the involvement of Christian leaders such as Martin Luther King and civil rights and very other liberation movements. But then on the other hand, and those same very conversations and those same struggles as well, how scripture was weaponized as well, and man-made translations and systems upheld that discrimination and that slavery and that marginalization, which in fact have enduring legacies, and those implications are felt today. So if you look at an example such as, you know, faith groups, Christian groups being responsible and helping with things like benevolent societies, hospitals, and education, you know, those are really good things. But then on the flip side, here in New Zealand, we also see the Royal Commission to the Historic Abuse and State Care. And we see those very institutions which were meant to help, which initially would have had a really good intention, ended up under the name of the church and other religious forces ended up harming as well. So it's not an easy case. I think there's the intention is there, the execution and the way that it's done is not necessarily good. But I think going forward, we have to reckon with that, and we can't just say things about it. It actually needs to translate into actions. So a local example where I'm from at the moment in Taranaki is a church here called St. Mary's Cathedral in New Plymouth, and they're an Anglican parish. And they've partnered with local iwi to create this really amazing place called Te Whare Hono Ngā, which is a place for peace and understanding. And so they worked with Te Aotearoa and many of the other Māori groups here. And what they've done is they've reckoned that the role that the Christian church here and Christian groups, their church, had done here in New Plymouth and how destructive that was. And so the way that they've reckoned with that is to create this new third space, which is a place of reconciliation. And then students can come into this place and learn about the history of colonization and learn about how that affected our local iwi over here. That place sits on the church grounds, but outside the church grounds, and you can't actually use it without express permission of Māori who are involved in that as well. And it needs to be used for a reconciliation purpose. That came about because what the church needed to do was actually to reckon with its history of colonization. So, we know this, but how do we then apply it and put it into sort of actions that actually do something now? So instead of running away from our past and being in denial of our past, it's actually working with that in a way that's actually going to build a better future for us. So that actually understands by saying, looking at how our different scriptural texts, our interpretations of those texts have actually impacted local communities and identities in the past, but also today as well. And so in my faith tradition, there's a decolonization movement happening all around the world, whether it's by African, whether it's by Pacific people here in this part of the world. Everywhere they're sort of looking at, okay, how do we embrace this faith that has been passed on to us, which we don't want to abandon, but actually has that history of hurt and that history that has suppressed who we are, and not just suppressed in an implicit way, but explicitly so as well. If you look at the experience of Tangata Whenua here in New Zealand, there was the active suppression and the elimination of their Indigenous practice and their ideas as well. And so many groups are trying to figure out how to do this, whether that's decolonizing those scriptural texts, or whether it's actually decolonizing movements as well, and also structures. So for instance, a couple of organisations I'm involved with called Zeal and Practice. They're both youth organisations here in New Zealand, but they have a Christian whakapapa. They've got a Christian background. But they know in today's modern society, because of what has happened traditionally with the churches and the way it interacts with different communities, that they need to give people from communities that weren't represented prior and communities that potentially they have hurt before, not them specifically, but the Christian church at large, and they need to reckon with that. So that means that in their leadership structures, in their teaching, that they are now incorporating to our Māori concepts, tikanga, and making sure that people who weren't at the decision-making table from different backgrounds, from different ethnicities, from different identities that weren't there are now being represented there. So this is just not an idea like, let's do better. That structurally we can do better. There's actually things that people can do. So I think, those are ways that I've seen this type of movement happen. One quick thought I just want to make here as well is that I recognise that many people who are on the call might be from human rights backgrounds and perhaps secular backgrounds as well. And for a long time, this has already been raised in our session already. It's quite easy for some groups that don't have that faith or who are very aware of the harm that religions have done globally as well as New Zealand to actually dismiss that. But I think if you're in that space, I think one of the things that you could do that would really help with the social cohesion and unity in New Zealand is to not dismiss that and to not just label everyone that has a religion as something that you imagine it to be, that traditional stereotype that we have. So if you allow people like us who are on this call and many others that are like us, the space and the room to be ourselves and the space for society not to have to label or to put people into binary categories of religious, therefore, whatever, and then secular, therefore. It's just not that simple. And I think the society that we want to build in New Zealand is much more respectful of people and individuals, and also of the different backgrounds we have and the context by which many of us, including my community, 70% still identify as Christian today. It's not that because they're brainwashed. It's so easy to say that. There's another compelling reason for that that's actually worked for them, and I think we need to. The rest of society needs to allow us to be that we can have coherent identities, multiple identities, and those things being coherent and respected.
Hi, Andre. Can I maybe just pause to give an opportunity for the three of you to reflect back to each other how you feel right now after these first two kind of larger questions that we've posed? I think one thing that's coming to my mind is gratitude for your honesty and your bravery, being able to, all three of you, speak obviously so articulately, which was predicted, but clearly as well. And I think a lot of it does come from a lot of personal reflection, but as all three of you have mentioned, faith in action, this idea that, you know, you have been practicing and letting deeds, not words, you know, shape your understanding of faith. So maybe if we could just pause, if there's any reactions to the kōrero so far, that would be really, really lovely, and we can then move on. We've got a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A, and I do have one question that I do want us to sort of end on, but yeah, if there are any reactions at this moment, that would be wonderful.
Well, there was no heart emoji, so I had to like do it with my hands. But as Andre was speaking to his last point just about, yeah, it sort of reminds me of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because I think so often when we're trying to tackle these big systemic issues, it's so easy to just want to kind of go like, okay, well, obviously religion wasn't working, so like, let's find a system that can solve for this. But the reality is that, you know, this prejudice is kind of like a spiritual condition. So sometimes a spiritual condition will need a spiritual medicine or a spiritual answer. And so to completely throw that and abandon it and just put all of our eggs in the basket of like a politician or some other structure, some other man-made structure that we think is going to fix this for everyone, I think is just, we're seeing that isn't working. So to me, to be able to enfold religious groups into that dialogue and conversation in a real way, and to be able to have this consultation together and offer what we think some possible solutions can be, that is where the like good stuff is. And that's where the answer is. It's not in like furthering this us and them between like believers and non-believers, and now let's try to figure out unity and abolishing prejudice. Like, it has to be a world where we can come together and have this honest dialogue. And I just really appreciate also my co-panelists, just their ability to speak to how nuanced this is and complicated, and all of those intersections, you know, putting us in a place where it's not these easy compartments to be like, this is who I am as this person, and in this race, and in this religion, and in this identity, and in this gender. It all sort of melds together. And I just feel like both of them spoke way more articulately than I have to those complexities and intricacies, and not kind of being scared of diving into that part of it too, which is uncomfortable and hard, and awkward because we don't have a language for it well developed yet. So I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Hey, I just want to say you've added so much value to the conversation. I think this is the beauty of the panel, right? That we don't all have to say, you know, replicate what each other's saying. So thanks for representing the stuff that I wasn't able to say. One of the things I'll just say, just a quick story to sort of explain sort of the intersections within my own group, is that when I think about the experience of my dad has passed away now, but he was a taxi driver. And when the government issued its apology for the Dawn raids a couple of years ago, it really just acknowledged the racism that many Pacific people had faced here in New Zealand over the 60s and 70s. First of all, while this is important for me to note as a Pacific person, I don't want to decenter the experience of Tangata Whenua Māori. So our experience is adjacent to that, and they've experienced incredible legislative harm and every other thing you can think of. So I don't want to descend to that. But racism was really real for my family growing up. My dad would come home from a shift on the taxis, and he was a boxer, but there were countless times that my dad was either stolen from, abused, and then also physically assaulted as well. And I remember one time when Dad came home and he was abused, and him and my mum didn't even think of going to the hospital, because I knew that if they went to the hospital, the inference from hospital staff would be that my dad started it because he was a Samoan man. So that's the kind of society that we grew up in, right? But when my dad went to church on the weekends, it was the one place that gave him dignity. It was the one place, he was a very smart, intellectual man, that he could actually share who he was, and he got to speak from the front as a preacher, got to share his intellect. And as Samoans as well, Samoan men often do the cooking, and so when it came time for lunch, he was able to go to the kitchen and to cook there and to serve his community. In the absence, when society and when government weren't there, for my dad and my family, the church was. So it's really important that we explore those narratives as well, because often we can just have this very, as I've said before, very binary idea of who's in and who's not. And so, yeah, I think I would like to see in the future more of those ones, even people on this call, just explore the diversity in there. The irony, for me speaking, I'm not speaking on behalf of Christians, but the irony is that I speak and I represent my faith here, and being a Christian, is that many people are looking at me because I'm gay and then saying he's not a Christian. So it's quite hilarious, you know, that I'm here talking about how faith and how Christianity has been such an important agent and force in my life, and by the very same token, someone's not going to understand it because of me. And so this is what I'm trying to say, like, we need more of these narratives that allow the diversity and the richness of who we are. And if we don't do that, we're not going to have a society that not only respects people with different experiences, but more that the institutions such as religions and churches actually don't grow, and they don't allow, to use the experience of people like us on the call and others who don't have the common experience, they won't be able to grow into to helpfully and constructively modify it into what society needs them to be at this stage in our history.
Thank you, Andre. It's actually an incredibly important point to sort of move us towards this idea of, like, then what would that look like if we were to engage with questions around religion and faith and the intersections with multiple identities as has come up. And in this particular context, we're talking about race and religion. If we were to learn how to do that constructively and powerfully, while of course not dismissing those harmful practices, the past that we have, and the specific populations that have experienced it. But if we were to imagine a future Aotearoa that is free, like if we were to really become visionary right now and think about a society free from racial and religious prejudice, what would that look and feel like? And you know, we talked a little bit about the actions that are necessary to achieve that. But if we were to think about actions at sort of like kind of three levels, if we were to consider society as having kind of three key protagonists, you know, Golriz, you mentioned it sort of at the individual and collective level, but if we were to break the collective down into sort of community and institutions, which have come up. So if we were to reflect on the three key protagonists, the individual, the community, and the institutions, to build this beautiful vision of a prejudice-free Aotearoa, what would that look like? Tahirah, I would love to start with you, please.
Yeah, of course. Kia ora. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question, because something I think a lot about is, and like it would take me a while to get to, you know, the solutions, but just talking about the you know, what it means to be radically imaginative, and how colonialism and all these things really, you know, because we're dealing with such pressing issues, it does steal our like childlike ability to enter that space of imagination. And it's a like by answering and exploring questions like that is a reclamation of that, you know, imaginative state. And Moana Jackson speaks about like taking leaps of taking leaps of faith to poetic imagination to enter that realm, and that's something I often think about. despite all my, it may come across that I'm all about, fighting the oppression, but, this is an integral part of it, is imagining a better future. And so I think the basis for that, I think, of getting us towards that future is, honoring in this context of Aotearoa, honoring Te Tiriti and honoring the status of Māori as tangata whenua, and, land back, Indigenous self-determination. My bio said I'm passionate about these things, so, staying true to that. And then also, I think I also wanted to take advantage of the fact that I know there are so many Pākehā probably on this call who want to be part of the struggle but don't know maybe what their contribution can be, and I feel like that's such an important, because of the role and the place that Pākehā hold in Aotearoa in our current context, that we can't ignore, and also the burden can't fall just on faith communities. I'm not saying that Pākehā can't be part of faith communities, but that it can't fall on ethnic communities to bear that burden of creating a better future. So just on that note, I would love to read a quote from a post by Tata organisation, and a shout out to them because they do amazing mahi, that speaks to imagining what the role of Pākehā might be in the future. So I might just read that. Okay. Imagine a future where the word Pākehā brought to mind stories and songs and communities of repair. A future where we tell our children stories of how we let go of policing people's bodies and hearts, letting light in to grow our worlds bigger and bigger. And in doing so, we repaired our relationships to ourselves. A future where our children feel deeply connected to the land and people around them because of their unique kinship with tangata whenua. A future where they have a deep sense of knowing that they have a special place here that is built on generations of reciprocal care. A future where the rivers and mountains know who they are. Where they get to say, he Pākehā aho, a treaty person from Aotearoa. And a buzzing warmth will glide up their body as they fill with pride in their unique connection with this land. We could be Pākehā, the people who healed themselves by letting justice live and letting wealth die. The ones who loosened their grip and in doing so could feel the world again. The people who let the fear of the other slide through our fingers like water on a gentle boat ride. When we enter a room, people will say with bright smiles, there go the Pākehā, the people who unforgot their kinship to the world. They can teach us a lot about designing new ways of being and loving ourselves through uncomfortable accountability. Can you see this future? Where our descendants hold festivals to honour us, where they dance stories to remember the ways in which their ancestors betrayed whiteness to protect their chance of living fully. Imagine who we might be beyond settler colonialism. Kia ora.
From you. Thank you. Golriz, love to hear your thoughts.
I just wanted to say
I do feel sorry that you have to follow that, I must admit.
There's no way. That was so beautiful. I just I closed my eyes and just was listening, and it was really, this question. I love Tahirah saying radically imaginative. It's funny because it's kind of a simple question in some regards, simplistic in the sense of imagine a future with no harm, no injustice, no war. And a part of me is that should be simple. But honestly, as I went through the exercise, it was impossible. And impossible because my lived experience, these 40 years on this earth, I've never felt it or seen it for an instant. And it kind of makes me emotional. I just think, if we don't hold an imagination for it, how will we build it? So we definitely have to do that work and that exercise and that being radically imaginative and trying to dream up what that future is. That poem was so beautiful. I really feel like we could just end on that. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's a complete reconstruction. It doesn't look like the world we know today. It's demilitarization. It's really big changes that I don't think I've yet to see. I'm seeing something collapse and something be built up in its stead, but I don't feel like I've ever lived a day on this earth and not felt the brokenness of it, the injustice of it, the oppression of it. From a very personal note, you know, due to religious prejudice, due to racial prejudice, I didn't even get to have a relationship with my own grandparents. They were in Iran. I was here, a little, you know, Kiwi kid in New Zealand, and that we couldn't forge a relationship. I feel so hurt. And I feel like I'm always in the in-between. I'm a person who's here and in love with being in Aotearoa and so grateful every day to be here, and yet so displaced from my own birth land and just a complete void of connection to this land where I incarnated on this earth. So that feeling of all these systems working against me being whole, like, really is so painful. And I imagine a future where people don't feel that and can really feel themselves and feel witnessed and seen and see each other. And I guess that's the thing, like, in a really simplified way, if we can fully see each other and also feel seen, that is so healing. There's so much therapy we could avoid. There's so much harm we could avoid if that is something we truly felt and had. So a future of that, to me, is the ideal, where no one holds themselves in hierarchy and in a space of power over someone else, and really believes that we are one and we are interconnected to such a degree that if there is harm happening, it is harm to me, and our freedoms are linked in that way. So I long for that future. I don't know that I can imagine it in a really concrete way. That poem was like a little glimpse at it. And I think that exercise, we need to do more and more of that, because again, without that radical imagination, like, how do we build that world? So sorry to get emotional. I should have just said nothing after the poem.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for those beautiful reflections from you both. I think for me, it is hard to imagine, but I think we've seen glimpses of it as well. And so for me, let's assume 500 years from now or 100 years from now that we've really got to act together as a society. Māori and others are recognised in their own country, that we have an equitable and equal society. That, all assuming that hopefully happens, that we've actually reconciled our history and our harm. I would love for us to have a society that has owned its past, that has been able to have the robustness and the security to be able to know, yes, these things have happened, but they're not going to happen again. I would love a society that is truly inclusive, where not only we would be borrowing from Te Ao Māori concepts in terms of knowing who we are, having a unique Aotearoa identity here, but also from other groups as well. I remember in the unfortunate, terrible wake of the March 15 mosque attacks, and the Ministry of Justice, the Minister of Justice at that time had hosted hui, speaking to Muslim communities up and down the country. And I know one of the early reflections was that some Muslim rangatahi were talking about how they thought that the Samoan or the Pacific concept, Pan-Pacific concept of talanoa, which is a way of talking and to discuss issues, to start off somewhere and then eventually get somewhere, how they thought that was a really useful framework in terms of their discussions. So while the context for that is absolutely horrible, and I wouldn't wish that upon anyone else, that you need to go through that, what we're seeing here is communities using other communities, not culturally appropriating, but seeing beauty and seeing the strength and of concepts from other communities and being able to use those. Going back to your beautiful poem, like, if the dominant culture, Pākehā, others will be able to use also these references as well without feeling like it's diminishing their own sense of who they are, then that would be really wonderful. Imagine a day in the future, because we have a very poor public discourse, unfortunately, in New Zealand around religion even. The fact that we're having this conversation, just want to shout out to Kāhui, Tika, Tangata, which is awesome. But we don't have that. In other countries, you can talk about religion robustly without... In the absence of that robust discussion, what will happen is that the people at the sharp end of the stick, who often have the most extreme views, get all of the airspace. And then what we don't have is we don't have mature conversations like we're having now. So I'd love Aotearoa where we're able to do all of that, and where religion isn't seen as extreme, and at the same time, those of us who are in religious settings aren't perpetuating that, because we've changed the way that we're doing stuff as well.
Thank you, Golriz. Thank you, Tahirah, for your beautiful, beautiful contributions, your insights. I have a long list of summary points, which I see we are at time, and unfortunately, we also couldn't get to the beautiful questions, some very important questions that came through. This is clearly a conversation we must continue to have. Some of the top points I think that has come out from this panel today was first and foremost to recognize our connectedness, and as Golriz shaped it in the words of the oneness of humanity, to be aware and protect against both the subtle and overt forms of racism and religious prejudice in society, to live an individual and collective life that strives to be free from religious and racial prejudices, to appreciate the complexity and to grapple with the challenges of this vision that we have discussed today, and to consider the best ways that we can contribute to the eradication of prejudices at both an individual and collective level. And I'm reminded of this beautiful analogy that actually came to some of the children that I was engaging with, Golriz, the other day. This concept of, in the beginning, how small is a seed? But in the end, that seed becomes a tree. And the sort of invocation to us to not look at the seed, but to look at the tree and its leaves and its blossoms and its fruits. And so we are at this particular juncture in society, but we have this vision, and it is the hope of many that we will be able to achieve it through that hard work that we discussed earlier. So thank you all so much. And to the many that joined us, thank you. And thank you again for your questions and your comments, many, many encouraging and positive comments that have come through. Our recording will be put up on the Te Kāhui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission YouTube page, where you can view, and for those who were unable to watch it live. I'm going to just pass it over to you, Andre, to please close with a karakia, and thank you again to our wonderful panelists.
Awesome. Well, I was a Samoan pastor, so I'm just going to do a prayer for 1 hour. Just joking, I'll just do a very short blessing. We pray a blessing upon all those who have joined, and for our beautiful country, acknowledging the hurt and the harm that people have experienced, particularly our Muslim whānau, on the anniversary of the 15 March terrorist attacks. But we also pray for us to do everything that we are meant to do within our power to make this world a better place. Amen.
Thank you so much. Go well and go safely. Thank you. Ka kite.
Kia ora, ka kite.
Thank
Kia
you.
ora.